Renee Good, a 37-year-old mother of 3 living in Minnesota, was shot dead by the ICE agent Jonathan Ross. The footage of this killing brought with it a flurry of discourse and highlighted a complete detachment from observable reality, as Good's life and death were thoroughly distorted through a combination of statements from government officials, commentary in conservative media, and fake information spread on social media.
She then proceeded to weaponize her vehicle, and she attempted to run a law enforcement officer over.
I don't think the world needs another YouTube creator trying to dissect bits of footage like they're an expert, so instead I'd rather highlight comments from more knowledgeable sources. Here is some commentary about the training of the agent from former federal agent Eric Ballier.
You should not be intentionally putting yourself in front of a vehicle unless absolutely necessary. My training was that you cannot use deadly or lethal force solely to stop a fleeing vehicle.
Ben Jones, an assistant professor of public policy and research associate in the Rocks Ethics Institute at Penn State, writing about the incident from an academic perspective, said, "Videos show the officer trying to open the door of the vehicle that Good was driving, while another officer appears to be in front of the vehicle as she tried to pull away. Shooting to prevent the driver simply from getting away would have been in violation of agency policy and obviously inconsistent with prioritizing the protection of life." He then criticizes how, in spite of a 2022 executive order, ICE has not adopted use of force policies to inform officers to get out of the way of moving vehicles where feasible. More than just Ross's sloppy behavior, he's highlighting the institutional failure of ICE to prepare its agents. But more than just the personal failings of an ICE agent and the institutional failures of the ICE agency, there persists this wider discourse that perhaps Renee Good deserved to be shot. Speaking to NPR, Julia Kiem, a former assistant secretary for intergovernmental affairs at the Department of Homeland Security in the Obama administration, spoke to that.
People talk about it in the political space. Well, she was not compliant, therefore she's dead, right? It doesn't work that way. Use of force is about a graduated escalation so that you don't get to a shooting immediately. And you didn't see any of that in any of the videos.
If it seems like I'm holding the ICE agent to a higher standard of behavior than Renee Good, you would be right. Someone employed by the government to supposedly engage in law enforcement is trained and should be expected to behave at that higher standard. Anyone who would sooner try to figure out what Renee Good or her wife or anyone else might have been doing that justified their death while ignoring or downplaying the actions of Jonathan Ross is inverting that expectation in a way that preemptively excuses the state. People resist, arrest, or interfere with law enforcement every single day, but the readiness people have to use that pretext to approve a death sentence is chilling, and the justifications for that have included several outright lies. Kristi Noem, the United States Secretary of Homeland Security, was confronted with some of those lies in an interview with CNN.
Your description, they were attempting to push out their vehicle and a woman attacked them and those surrounding them and attempted to run them over and ram them with her vehicle, is not what we see on the videotape, and it's not.
It absolutely is the facts of what happened on the ground that day. They were there pushing out a vehicle earlier. They had helped each other.
But that's not what you said.
Nothing in the footage we've seen confirms any of this. The ICE agents were not trapped in the snow, and they were not approached by the driver. Rather, they approached Renee Good, and she only began to drive when they were attempting to surround her. I'm going to play a different section from later on in this interview and another YouTube creator's reaction, this one coming from The Rubin Report, hosted by Dave Rubin.
I have provided you with facts and information to back up every single word that we have said and every single part of this investigation. And if you don't like it, that's fine. But we're going to continue to do the right thing to keep the American people safe.
Do you see what I mean about how things are different right now and you really have to acknowledge it? Like, that is right what she just said. But she did a great job right there. Enough. And this is what Stephen Miller has also become a master of. And who do you give the credit to all of this for? It's Trump.
Although to me, it seemed like Kristi Noem was dodging the question and trying to change the subject, Dave Rubin instead saw Noem turning the tables to call out Jake Tapper's hypocrisy. But let's go back to literally the first thing Jake Tapper says after the moment the clip is cut.
We're going to continue to do the right thing to keep the American people safe.
I know that you'd like to make me the topic of this and not what happened, but I did ask a Democratic senator just a few minutes ago about AOC's comments, and I don't actually even know what you're talking about when I ask questions as if like that's an assertion. It's a question. How can you make a conclusion before an investigation? And there really isn't an answer other than you saw the video.
Dave Rubin's commentary is completely empty. He's not really reacting to the clip he's playing. He just kind of riffs on Jake Tapper in general. And while I'm certainly in favor of roasting Tapper for a variety of reasons, These clips only show him doing a decent job trying to get answers from an elected official. I almost feel like I have to apologize to all of you for even spending a few moments talking about Dave Rubin because it's trivially easy to point out how bad this commentary is. There's clearly an audience that finds this stuff compelling. But what I think the success of this clip reveals is how what drives these narratives is not meaningful commentary, but rather the aesthetic of commentary and how it fits into a broader conservative media landscape. Dave Rubin says nothing of value or substance, but he has the appearance of a commentator and his commentary is pointing in a direction that defends the administration and ICE. When you understand that context, it explains why something as shabby as this would seem far more compelling than it actually is. And this is something I wish I could see more of when it comes to particularly mainstream responses to any sort of media like this. It's not just looking at the individual actors and the ridiculous things they say. It's understanding how they exist in a broader landscape and how there is an entire ecosystem designed to elevate and lift these types of commentaries into a higher place than they actually are, all of it riding on these aesthetics. As I was putting up this video for patrons, I saw the news that Alex Preddy, a 37-year-old intensive care nurse working at a Veterans Affairs hospital, was shot by ICE agents in Minneapolis. Multiple camera angles emerged showing 6 ICE agents surrounding and then beating him before shooting him several times. Anyone who's seen the footage doesn't need me to tell them how to feel about it. Analysis from a variety of outlets seemed to be reaching the same conclusion, that Preddy had been disarmed by an ICE agent before he was killed. Just like with Renee Good, the Department of Homeland Security issued statements that were observably false, and numerous other government officials followed suit. Following along was the same propaganda machine we saw kick into gear after Renee Good was shot, all of it attempting to defend or distract from the obvious truth of the footage. As things in Minnesota keep escalating, I have no idea what will happen next. I certainly didn't expect another shooting so shortly after Renee Good, and I certainly hope there won't be another shooting after Alex Preddy. And those are just the shootings we've seen on camera. We should also acknowledge Keith Porter, who was shot by an off-duty ICE agent back in December, and an as of yet unnamed Venezuelan man who was shot in Minnesota. As this story keeps progressing, I think there is some value looking back at one key piece of propaganda that was used to help target a community of immigrants. It was produced by a young man named Nick Shirley. Titled, "I Investigated Minnesota's Billion-Dollar Fraud Scandal," the video currently sits at over 3 million views and has led to responses both federal and local. The video presents itself as an independent investigation of fraud in Minnesota, specifically within the Somali American community. The first section of the video, which happens to be the one getting the most attention, focuses on childcare facilities with Shirley and men only identified as David going to daycares and then claiming not to see any children there.
There's nobody here. You won't see a single child at any of these facilities.
Instead of jumping into this video, I think it would be more interesting to look a bit more into the backstory of where this narrative comes from. And we have to start with the Child Care Assistance Program in Minnesota. Established in 1990, the Child Care Assistance Program, or CCAP for short, is a welfare program designed to provide low-income families with funding to help ease the financial burden to care for children. I guess the name made that obvious, though. This support includes funding for childcare while parents have to work. Historically, there have been several instances of fraud involving CCAP, though one in particular is especially relevant to the Nick Shirley video. In February of 2018, local news station KMSP Fox 9, operating out of Minneapolis, ran a story about millions of dollars filling suitcases being flown out of the city, possibly to terrorists abroad.
The money is usually headed to the Middle East, Dubai, and points beyond. Our sources say last year alone, more than $100 million cash left MSP in carry-on luggage.
It would eventually connect this activity to child care payments, and this fraud was connected to the Somali community.
According to public records and government sources, most are owned by Somali immigrants.
The reporting caused enough of a stir that a special review was published in March of 2019, analyzing many of the claims that were presented. This comes from the Office of the Legislative Auditor in the state of Minnesota. The findings were far less alarming than the original news report. The more sensational claim of money being sent to terrorist groups couldn't be substantiated at all. When they asked Scott Stillman, a former Department of Human Services employee who was interviewed as a source in support of the Fox 9 report, he declined to provide any evidence and instead pointed the investigation towards law enforcement for that. The report read, We sought evidence from investigators, law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and court records, but did not find it there either. The increasing amount of money being sent out on airports isn't really a mystery, though. It's because couriers have become the preferred method for Somali Americans in Minnesota to send money back to their families in the 2010s. And there's an interesting story on why that happened. Somalia uses the Hawala financial system, a traditional Islamic means of distributing financial resources. Historically, money could be sent from financial institutions like an American bank to a Hawala in Somalia, but this changed in 2010 when two Somali American women sent $8,600 to a Hawala that found its way to al-Shabaab fighters. After that, banks refused to work with Hawalas, leading Somali Americans to turn to couriers to send money back home to family members. Although the risk remains that somehow this money could end up in the hands of terrorists, that's just as true as if they had sent it to a bank. There is no evidence that all this money being sent via courier is actually ending up in the hands of terrorists. Rather, they're just going to Hawalas, and it's assumed that, therefore, it must be going to terrorists afterwards. There also isn't any evidence that the money going to these couriers is coming from daycares. What the local news was doing in its report was pairing the fact that payments via couriers was increasing at the same time payments to daycares were increasing. This is a great example of a correlation where no causality is actually presented. There was also some noise that some of these couriers aren't actually going to Somalia, but rather to Dubai, and that's because the headquarters for some of these Hawalas happen to be in Dubai. So the claim that this money is being funneled to terrorist groups isn't really substantiated by any meaningful evidence. The other claim of $100 million in CCAP fraud a year isn't quite so clear-cut. On the most basic level, the figure seems to be inflated. Over the course of several years, prosecution of fraud amounted to somewhere between $5 and $6 million. A far cry from the $100 million a year that was being cited. However, the actual amount of fraud is difficult to determine, and this report declined to make an actual estimate of how much fraud is happening in the state when it comes to CCAP funding. At least one CCAP fraud investigator believed the $100 million figure could be accurate, but unlike what the Nick Shirley video alleges, it's not about daycares sitting empty all day, but rather daycares not providing adequate service, like adults spending more time chatting amongst themselves or on their phones rather than watching the children. Representatives from the Department of Human Services more strongly disagreed with the $100 million figure because prior investigations didn't turn up anywhere near that amount. While there was certainly some amount of fraud that was unaccounted for, the $100 million figure seemed unrealistic. And when looking at the total budget of the CCAP service, it would account to more than a third of all funds allocated. In spite of the findings in this report, particularly the lack of evidence connecting fraud to funding terrorism, this talking point continued to lumber on. Here's an example from a local radio show on WZFG talking about it.
Dude, it goes back pre-COVID. The daycare one was 2017. Yeah, that's $250 million.
I don't know how it suddenly became $250 million, but that's the interesting thing about these fraud cases. Once they're discussed in the media, the figures start getting inflated, and the type of fraud that may or may not be happening is frequently exaggerated. In May of 2025, there was another report that looked specifically at attendance records at child care assistance providers that raised some interesting questions. A news article from MinnPost covering the report said, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services Office of the Inspector General sampled 1,155 child care centers and found that 11% of the payments made to those centers in 2023 had errors. But that doesn't necessarily mean there was fraud. Improper payments is an umbrella term that could include fraud. An 11% rate puts Minnesota above the permissible 10% threshold established by the federal government, Ewan said. On average, nationwide, the rate is 4%. So while childcare fraud is something Minnesota has been working to reduce in recent years, these are not new issues, but they are being repackaged and they are being promoted in ways to make it seem like there is an epidemic, said Elliot Haspel, a national childcare expert, on a call with reporters this week. What I think we're seeing here is that there is grounds for an investigation. There is some amount of fraud happening here, and it may be more than the government realizes. How much that actually is would require a careful look at the financial records and actual day-to-day activities of these daycares. We did not really get any of that in the Nick Shirley video. But with all that background in hand, I think we can now take a look at it more closely. To prove fraud is happening, Shirley and his buddy David go to daycare centers and start asking about kids.
Where are the kids? Where's anybody? Where are the kids? Where are the 74 kids? Did you lose them? We're just wondering where the children are.
We are just curious, where are the children at? Where are the children?
What makes this video seem effective is that it has the aesthetic of on-the-ground journalism. They're providing documents that supposedly create a paper trail and an intrepid journalist with a camera going door to door demanding answers. It creates the vibe of a guerrilla journalist only looking for the truth. The problem is that the documents really only seem to catalog funding for these daycares. Knowing how much a daycare is being paid isn't really evidence of fraud. The evidence of fraud would require direct investigations of the facilities. In the 2019 report, there are details of how the government conducts fraud investigations, reviewing security tapes, checking the records of each facility, and interviewing people running the daycare. Shirley does none of that. He doesn't seem to spend more than 15 minutes or so at each spot, typically not even getting through the front door, and when he leaves, he declares that he's discovered fraud. The handful of people he speaks to on camera are never identified by name, and while a few seem to work at the location he goes to, he spends more time talking to random people passing by who we have no reason to believe know anything about these locations. Shirley's pal David claims to have been monitoring these daycares, though he doesn't provide any evidence of that. Shirley doesn't express any skepticism towards him, even when David makes some very bold claims.
Fraud is worse here than anywhere else ever in history, anywhere.
Local news outlets have already covered this quite extensively, providing footage of kids not only showing up to some of the daycares Shirley visited at later dates, but in some cases showing up in security footage the day Shirley was checking them out. This is from CBS Minnesota.
Records show Minnesota officials last visited the daycare in November, noting some corrected and ongoing violations related to day-to-day operations, but no record of fraud.
Here's an excerpt from a Minnesota Star Tribune article about attendance at one location highlighted by Shirley. A middle-aged woman watched over the children as a Somali lullaby played softly in the background. The facility is licensed for 102 children. About 50 were there. Shirley also doesn't address the fact that there are public records of visits being made to these daycare centers, some of them noting violations. Nothing is actually being provided to substantiate David's claim that these daycares are always empty. We have no reason to believe any of the daycares were empty when Shirley and David visited either. They're kept out of several of them, and if a group of 8 men, one of them carrying a camera, showed up at a daycare, that's suspicious enough to not want them near the children. In a podcast appearance later on, Nick Shirley has played some of these criticisms of his work. In one, it's pointed out how Shirley was showing up with a group of 8 people and that there's security footage of children attending the daycare. Here's Shirley's response.
They're receiving millions of dollars. What's the purpose of receiving all these dollars if you have, even if it's 12 children compared to the 40 that they're supposed to have? And why are all their windows blocked out? Why are they so scared to show people what they're doing behind doors? So, yeah, maybe. Actually, they're not. They're fraudulent business. So, what's the purpose of having a daycare where you can't even show the public?
It's a rambling mess. The closest he gets to addressing the most important point, that children do attend this daycare and that it isn't empty, he says that 12 children is less than the 40 they have listed at their capacity. He doesn't seem to understand that daycares don't always operate at full capacity. The number of kids attending can fluctuate throughout the year, and that these businesses aren't paid based on their capacity alone, they're paid based on their attendance records. There's a whole website explaining this, including showing examples of the forms where fraud would be happening. Daycares have to declare the rate of care provided for each child, such as the amount of hours a child is scheduled to be at the daycare, and then they have to make a record of how long they actually show up for. The last amount is what the state uses to calculate how much they're reimbursed for. So when looking at the records of how much these daycares are receiving from CCAP funding, you wouldn't look at the total capacity. You would need to look at attendance records and compare that to the number of kids you see on a given day. Without looking at those records and comparing them to the in-person visits over a period of time, you can't effectively prove fraud is happening. That doesn't mean fraud definitely isn't happening, of course. It means that the Nick Shirley video, where he showed up on a random day, hung around for what seemed like 15 minutes or so, isn't anywhere near close enough to determine if fraud is actually happening. Shirley's shock that he, David, and their mass security weren't allowed inside various daycares is taken as evidence of guilt. In addition to the fact that a group of men with a camera is trying to get in a daycare is already suspicious, the mass security who travel with him could be mistaken for ICE, which we saw one woman who was observing them do in the Nick Shirley video.
Don't open up!
And getting $4 million over the...
Open up, it's ICE!
This all happened outside the Quality Learning Center, which Shirley is very excited to point out has a typo in its sign. This is actually a key moment in the video because it provided a meme.
Quality Learning Center. I meant to say Quality Learning Center.
Don't open up!
They said They spelt learning wrong.
So many comments under these videos make reference to the Luring Center. This meme is actually incredibly important because it gave people something to latch onto when talking about this story and allow it to be spread online more easily. When engagement drives stories on social media, giving people a fun meme is a great way to bolster that type of engagement. Shirley even put it on a hoodie, which obviously he's selling online. Shirley's brief appearances at these daycares and a ridiculous credulity towards the vaguest claim of fraud are really all this section on daycares has to offer. And it's not even original, as local news station ABC5 KSTP covered the exact same story in January of 2025. They even hit up some of the same locations, such as Quality Learning Center. Later in the same report, KSTP reporter Jay Coles goes to Minnesota Child Care Center. Nick Shirley would visit the same location in his video. The local news report is slightly better, actually getting comment from an owner and highlighting safety violations reported by government inspectors. Much like Shirley, Coles is apparently unable to find children, though that is likely because no one wants to let him or his camera crew into their daycare. It's honestly not that compelling a report, as it also relies on missing information, but it's worth highlighting because it really reveals Shirley's video to be a lazy copy of the work Coles did. Not that I'm accusing him of plagiarism, it's actually fine for multiple people to cover the same story. But if fraud was so widespread, you'd think all of the daycares he highlighted would be new and different. But the fact that he went to places that had already shut out a camera crew before makes me think that perhaps he was expecting the same result. But there's actually a more interesting parallel that these two news stories have. Here's something from the beginning of the KSTP report.
Learning of growing concerns about the program from sources at the Capitol, I started looking into some of the daycares receiving the most money.
And going back to the Shirley video, here's a comment from David.
And then I have some contacts at the Capitol going back many, many years. And so the data that I'm getting is 100% accurate, coming directly from research done by people at the state Capitol.
Speaking to the press, the Minnesota State Republicans took credit for providing information to Shirley's investigation, something they apparently do with media.
Our caucus has been working to expose fraud for years, including working with Nick Shirley.
Much of the information that one of the gentlemen in that video was providing was due to information he got from the House Republican staff.
Nick Shirley would later go on to say that he has no idea who this woman is. Later, he would clarify that he got this information from David, and it seems he was the one who was speaking to someone in the government.
So her staff was the people that David had received the information from because David reached out, and she works inside the government, so she did actually a good job by doing what she's supposed to do.
Although Coles doesn't explicitly say where he got his information from, aside from it being someone at the Capitol, considering his report ends with an interview with Republican Lisa DeMuth, I think the inference is pretty clear that this whole story has been cooked up by the Republican Party in Minnesota. They are the one providing information to these media figures, and instead of considering that they might be part of some kind of political operation, or perhaps perfectly fine with being part of that operation, they decide to amplify these accusations by conducting investigations that honestly aren't terribly impressive. Going back to David, though, I was very curious to know who this guy was. He's only ever identified as David, and for some reason, Nick Shirley is very reluctant to provide any firm information on who he is and where he comes from, aside from he got a message from him on Instagram one time.
David messaged me on Instagram, and out of the hundreds of DMs I get, I just opened David's, and he had all the proof.
The Minnesota Star Tribune discovered this man's name is actually David Hawk. He has a long history of political activism. They also identify his likely contact is longtime friend Joe Marble, a committee administrator at the Minnesota House of Representatives who previously worked as a research assistant for the House Republican Caucus. Further investigating by The Intercept found that David Hawk had an Instagram account with a post that read, "Every Somali in MN is engaged in fraud, all of them." And another one read, "Even the blacks have had enough of the demon Muslims." After being contacted about these posts, he deleted his Instagram account. Also, I can't help but wonder if Nick Shirley, who said he first got into contact with David through Instagram, read any of these posts before deciding this was a guy he wanted to listen to about the state of fraud in Minnesota. Going back to the video, the other section is worse than the first, as Nick Shirley tries to expose healthcare fraud by walking through a medical plaza and asking for healthcare.
Yes, we'd like to speak about getting healthcare here? No. Why can't I get healthcare here?
I'm not sure what he's expecting to get by asking for healthcare, but it seems like he hasn't actually tried to figure out what some of these companies do. When he points to a listing, he doesn't acknowledge that many of the businesses listed have nothing to do with healthcare, like the law office, the daycare center, or the coffee company. But many of the healthcare companies in question here are ones that offer assisted living services. Shirley doesn't seem to understand what any of these businesses do.
This building, there were 14 of nearly the exact same businesses offering the exact same services.
Some of these businesses he walks by do, in fact, offer different services. For example, Serenity Center LLC specializes in adults with mental health conditions, while Blue Home Care specializes in helping seniors and people with physical disabilities. There can be all kinds of reasons why these companies are sharing office space, one of the key ones being that they offer all their services remotely. Limited capacity and different areas of specialty means they may not be in competition with one another either. We don't even have documentation outlining how much funding, if any, that these companies are getting. David just declares a dollar amount.
How much money do you think has been funneled through this building?
Every year, I would say 50 to 60 million at least.
This supposed fraud would be from a completely different program than the CCAP one that they were supposedly investigating in the earlier part of the video looking at childcare. So where does this estimate come from? We have no idea. Shirley then goes to another building and he declares these all to have the same kind of healthcare services, but again, he never explains what they are. He does show off that he is able to read signs. This is the full extent of his investigation. I'm going to list what services these companies provide as he reads off their names.
Multicultural Home Care, another Reliance Recovery Center, Mercy and Grace Care, Inc. Right here you have Den Eritrean Youth Development Association of Minnesota.
He takes a break from reading signs when he stumbles on the daycare. What's really amazing about this little stretch is that not only do all of these businesses offer unique services, and the Eritrean one is explicitly not Somali. When he resumes his sign reading investigation, he does find businesses that offer more similar services, though he doesn't go inside to check anything. It might have helped if Shirley had done any additional research aside from reading the sign, but this investigation isn't much more than that. And then he provides a made-up number.
For this building, I'm going to give an estimate of around $30 million for how much fraud is taking place. That is a very low estimate.
Where does that number come from? How is it low? We have no idea. But coupled with the last building, that's $90 million in fraud found just by walking down a few hallways. One of the important parts of journalism is providing tools to the audience to check someone's work by either providing additional sources or fully explaining how your investigation operates. Shirley doesn't really do any of that, pulling numbers out of nowhere and making references to government funding that he never provides evidence of. When he does reference a specific case that can actually be checked, it's in the preamble to this section where he references an FBI raid of a home healthcare provider. Here's how he presents it.
In fact, the FBI just did a raid a few days ago on a building similar to the one we are about to enter.
The entire building was not, in fact, raided. It was one business inside the building that was raided. A pretty important distinction since this investigation by the FBI alleges that this specific business was falsifying its billing records. The local news report alleges that increased funding for home care services like these is creating greater opportunities for fraud. And while that kind of skepticism is fine and certainly grounds for an investigation, Nick Shirley's work on the matter is to walk down hallways reading signs and asking for healthcare, then declaring that every business he passes by must be engaging in fraud. Much like his daycare investigation, it's lazy and completely lacking in the hard work required to uncover fraud. And the fact that there is a real record of fraud in these businesses is what makes it even more galling. Some good investigative journalism could very well expose something here, but we're not seeing that at all. We're just getting some guy wandering around, making declarations of fraud with little to no effort put into his investigations. This section got a lot less attention than the daycare one, maybe because it was so much more obviously of poor quality, or it might just be that people are only watching the first half of the video. It's reassuring to say that this aesthetic-based journalism has its limits and people won't be fooled by anything, but it's hard to believe that after the daycare section. There are some other telltale signs that this video is motivated by something other than a desire to expose fraud, such as its fixation on the Somali American community, including a brief bit on the state flag supposedly being changed to look like the flag of Somalia.
And here in Minnesota, if you take a look at the Minnesota state flag, they recently changed it and it very much so resembles the flag of Somalia.
I don't know what any of this has to do with fraud, but the new design was a contest winner, and you can see from the many other flags submitted, there was a real emphasis on a large star. This represents the North Star, which is associated with Minnesota. The reason for the change, though, was to modernize the flag, and because the seal on it was pretty racist. If you can't tell why from the first impression, Here's a poem written by Mary Eastman, the designer's wife, explaining what's on the seal. Give way, young warrior. Thou and thy steed give way. Rest not, though linger on the hills, the red sun's parting ray. The rock bluff and prairie land, the white man claims them now. A MinnPost article on the flag reflects on the poem, saying, Eastman's rhyme has the benefit of honestly reflecting the dominant feelings of white Minnesotans at the time, most of who wanted to eradicate Native Americans from their homeland. As such, the seal and flag represent sentiments that led directly to the genocide of Dakota people, and is one that Minnesotans should not celebrate in any way. That seems like a pretty good reason to update a flag. In a follow-up to the original Nick Shirley video, here's how David talks about the flag.
Well, Tim Waltz said your old flag was racist.
Yeah, it was a farmer with a plow horse. That's racist. Why, because it's somebody working? That's racism.
This is something else that's a real problem for the original video and much of the commentary afterwards. There's an inescapable air of racism about the whole thing, with moments like this.
These people are very violent. They're exceptionally violent. They want to repopulate as quickly as possible. So that's why all these Muslim women you see, they're always pregnant all the time. I mean, they're always at conflict. They're tribal people. They're always at war.
And this bleeds into a lot of paranoia about Muslims.
The idea of Islam is that the world is theirs, that we're invaders, that we don't have a right to anything, that Allah has created the world for them, and they're going to take it back.
And at least one stereotype I had never heard before.
Somalis do not send their children to childcare ever, not once. It violates their faith.
What does one even say to something that I already disproved with footage in this video? Well, maybe Nick Shirley has a good response.
Because it's actually unbelievable.
For once, I actually agree. Speaking about being honest, David is inflating the fraud numbers even higher.
How much money do you think has been sent around fraudulently here inside Minnesota?
Over the years, I would say anywhere from $80 to $100 billion.
There's no pushback from Shirley. He just moves on like he hasn't heard an extraordinary claim. This should be enough to explain how Nick Shirley, primarily using his own videos, is not a serious journalist, hiding behind the aesthetic of an independent, on-the-ground investigator. His work doesn't really amount to much. This is not a very common read for people with a certain kind of media diet, though. Someone who is awash in right-wing commentary that is designed to advance convenient narratives more so than actual journalism. Within that media space, Shirley was hailed as a hero, but it's not because his work was anything special. Rather, it was very convenient. The antagonism towards Minnesota's Somali community has been going on for a while. A few weeks prior, Donald Trump had referred to that community as garbage.
We're going to go the wrong way if we keep taking in garbage into our country.
Nick Shirley's video came out a few weeks after these comments, at a time when the administration was facing a lot of heat over its obstruction of releasing the Epstein files, which are speculated to be tying Donald Trump to the billionaire pedophile Jeffrey Epstein. Well, I should say tying him to Epstein more so than he already was. First Assistant U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson declared at a press conference that $9 billion in 14 Medicaid services in Minnesota may have been used fraudulently, but those were statements prior to any sort of audit that would have provided real numbers. No doubt, some amount of fraud has happened in Minnesota. There have been prosecutions and convictions to show as much. But so far, the actual dollar amount is unknown, and $9 billion is significantly higher than previous estimates of up to $1 billion. So I think the figure should be taken with a lot of skepticism. However, we won't be hearing any more from Thompson about this fraud because he quit the Justice Department. This comes after he refused to investigate Renee Good's widow. While it's hard to imagine Shirley being involved with any of this high-level planning, his video does seem incredibly useful. It was shared by J.D. Vance and Elon Musk, helping it go viral and get a lot of attention. It was the talk of right-wing media, praising the work in spite of its many glaring flaws. And soon Nick Shirley was making appearances on several different podcasts. And it's here I want to spend some time because I think this is just as important, if not more important, than the video itself. The fact that there is a media ecosystem designed to advance right-wing narratives that serve the interests of the Trump administration and reactionary politics more broadly. Before getting into the friendly appearances, Shirley briefly made an appearance on CNN where a journalist asked him some basic questions.
I wasn't trying to go inside, and there should be a way for somebody to actually be able to call that number and somebody to be able to answer. These aren't real businesses.
But surely you don't think a daycare should just be unlocked. You shouldn't be able to just walk into a daycare.
There should be a reception.
It is no, every daycare is locked.
Their doors are locked.
And so, okay, you bring up a fair point. Then why can't they actually give me information how to enroll a child?
Shirley crumbles so quickly, it's almost embarrassing. He doesn't have the skill or experience to deflect the questions, though his podcast appearances will show how these platforms don't just serve as a means to spread his face around, but also training him on how to handle hostile questions. I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between most of these interviews, largely because there are too many to tackle them one at a time, and a lot of these questions and answers are interchangeable. Also, I don't know the political affiliations of every podcast here, but their friendly platforming of Nick Shirley is definitely advancing a right-wing agenda. The media ecosystem I'm talking about includes a lot of explicitly right-wing sources, but quite importantly also includes a lot of supposedly politically neutral ones as well, that uncritically parrot right-wing talking points. If the rest of someone's podcast is about lifting kettlebells or something like that, they should probably focus on those topics instead of issues like this. One podcast appearance I'm also going to be highlighting is an exception to that, so just keep that in mind as I go along. The general tone of these podcast appearances is friendly. Most of Shirley's claims aren't really challenged too heavily, but there are some examples of interesting questions being asked. Here's one from the Iced Coffee Hour.
Now, what about the counter arguments I saw that people would be more closed off talking to you when you show up with a camera, or you pull up in like some SUV and they don't know who you are, versus just like some lady just walking up, knocking on the door?
A good counterclaim would do that be, well, just answer the question so there's no confusion.
This is a weird response when the more obvious reaction to a group of men with a camera showing up asking questions is to simply close the door in their face. The other iced coffee guy tries asking the question again a little later in the interview.
You are showing up to daycares, probably in a group of people with cameras, lighting equipment, stuff that generally causes a disturbance. And so if you're trying to enter, they obviously might be more apprehensive to let you in and fill out a document and, be in a room maybe with kids.
Well, if they're operating legally, why would they have any worries?
Shirley just can't engage with the question of how his approach put people on guard. This is a pattern for most of his responses to questions like these. It's not very good. Shirley would go on to expand upon his story, oftentimes without even the most basic of facts. Here's one appearance on the Modern Wisdom podcast.
There's obviously larger communities like the DHS inside of Minnesota.
What's the DHS, sorry?
The Department of Homeland Security.
The DHS in Minnesota is not referring to the Department of Homeland Security. It's the Department of Human Services. The two departments are completely different, and this is not a minor error. The Department of Human Services is the one that oversees the CCAP program that Shirley is saying is being defrauded. Here's another example of Shirley getting things wrong.
You have adult daycares. You have autism centers.
Adult daycares?
Yes.
What is that?
Adult daycares. Place for adults to get taken care of.
People with special needs?
I don't know. There's no one inside of them.
Okay, how do you advertise an adult daycare? What is it? It's literally called adult daycare?
Adult daycare. And then you have assisted living. So that's kind of confusing. You have adult daycare and you have assisted living.
It's a bit sad that the host has to explain what adult daycare might be. And then Shirley's point about assisted living being confusing is only confusing if you have no idea what the difference is between receiving care at home instead of at a special facility. It's the difference between having a personal nurse in your home and going to a hospital or doctor's office. Here's another mistake.
So what rules are out there to prevent abuse?
Yeah, I don't exactly know what rules they have for abuse, but if Elon Musk can't figure it out, it just shows how many guardrails there are.
He should at least be able to offer an answer about visitations from inspectors or auditing of financial records. In his video, he literally attended a meeting about fraud and what elected officials were supposedly trying to do about it. But he still somehow can't answer this question. Even if he doesn't think that the rules in place aren't sufficient for preventing fraud, he doesn't have the wherewithal to get out of this very basic question. Another interesting thing that happens in these interviews is we can see how a fraudulent talking point is created. This is from the Patrick Bet-David show, where Bet-David shows us his poor reading skills.
The U.S. Attorney's Office for Minnesota reported that Somali Americans made up 89% of those that had been charged in connection with the case of December 19. Trump has repeatedly criticized the state's large Somali community in recent weeks, meaning all the fraud that's happening, 89% of it was tied to that community.
That 89% figure will become very important. Bet-David in his commentary is saying that 89% of fraud in Minnesota is being committed by Somali Americans. If we do something wild and actually look at that sentence in its original context, it's 89% of those that had been charged in connection with the case. Now, if we click through that link, we can see that this figure is referring to a case where 82 of 92 defendants who have been charged so far being Somali American. The majority of these people, if not all of them, because the AP article is a little vague, are connected to one case, the Feeding Our Future scam, a massive case where $250 million was stolen as part of a scheme to defraud COVID relief programs. The real number of people charged with fraud, even in that case, hasn't been entirely settled, and more charges seem to be rolling out over time, so the exact number does fluctuate a little in a lot of articles I've read. But the real problem here is that this one case is being used as a stand-in for all fraud happening in the state of Minnesota. This is quite clearly ridiculous. Yet Nick Shirley will go on to repeat this figure many times over. I can't say I'm 100% confident that he's hearing this stat for the first time from Bet David, but it's after this interview it becomes a staple in his talking points.
89% of the population that is committing the fraud is Somalians. 89% of the fraud being committed by people inside Minnesota is by Somalians. 89% of the population committing the fraud is Somalian.
Shirley also has the tendency to mix up 89% of fraud being committed by Somali Americans and 89% of the Somali American community committing fraud.
And this isn't about the race. However, when 89% of that population is committing fraud, that's just a fact.
Eventually, when he goes on a more challenging podcast, Andrew Callahan asks him where this figure comes from.
I just want to know where it's from.
You want me to find it right now?
For sure, just so I can, I don't know, I believe you. I just want to make sure we have the exact.
Here, right here. Yeah, and it's not racist to say it.
Shirley apparently points them towards an AI summary of a social media post, not data from any kind of media source. Since this appearance, he's gone on to repeat this stat repeatedly, apparently unaware that it's not really being substantiated by anything, or at least he's not able to substantiate it. Shirley would spread a number of other faulty claims about Somali people in general. Here's an example.
What are Somalians known for?
Like stealing? Like boats and shit?
Yeah. It's just kind of... Captain Phillips.
Great movie.
This is like someone watching Hotel Rwanda and coming away from it thinking that Rwandans specialize in hospitality services. A 23-year-old should be capable of doing more than throwing out a lazy stereotype to justify such outrageous claims. But it gets worse.
So a Muslim man, he's able to have 4 wives. They go and work at these daycares. You could have up to 4 wives all collecting welfare for one marriage.
What a business model.
Yeah.
He'd say it again on another show, and there would be a reasonable response.
Have you got any evidence of guys that have got a whole family of wives that are working in a single place?
Well, it's kind of just a theory I have, but I mean, they're able to marry 4, and all the people working inside the daycares are women.
The host moves on from this atrocious response, and we just have to sit with this theory that Nick Shirley can provide no direct evidence of, aside from a negative stereotype about Muslims. This is especially ironic as Nick Shirley is a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints. He explicitly says he doesn't call himself a Mormon, but I'm not well-versed enough in LDS theology to understand the difference. Regardless, his prophet, Joseph Smith, was also a polygamist.
It's not a thing in Utah.
That's a negative stereotype?
Negative stereotype.
There's a whole soup of other things that happens in these interviews, like at one point Sean Ryan gives Nick Shirley a gun.
So that is the Sig Sauer P365 Legion. Don't point it at yourself.
I know.
I think that captures the general tone of what these podcasts are like. Very friendly, and they very much are happy to let Nick Shirley repeat his talking points with limited pushback, so they seem as though they are worth listening to. And it allows this narrative to take hold in the minds of their audience. It's quite clear that these hosts are actively participating with Shirley, giving him the space to make his case while doing very little to highlight the obvious flaws within it. The Andrew Callahan interview is the one exception. Although it wasn't exactly an intense grilling, it did at least demonstrate some pushback to the claims Shirley was making. There was a bit too much time offered to Shirley in the opening 10 minutes or so without any sufficient pushback to the narrative he was constructing, but there were enough moments that I think reveal that Shirley is in way over his head, like this revealing moment.
If you ask a Muslim man, if we were to go to war with a country in the Middle East, ask them who they would support. That will tell you everything you need to know.
I'm on it.
I don't think you need to be an expert in history to remember a moment in time when the United States was at war with a country in the Middle East. And it's not that difficult to find evidence of Muslim Americans serving in the U.S. military. If Nick Shirley had the least bit of curiosity about the subject, he might have done some kind of research before opening his mouth to say something that is obviously not true. But it does show us where he's coming from and the sort of stereotypes that inform his thinking. There are another 2 moments in this interview that I really want to highlight because I think they reveal something very specific about Shirley.
So the fear now that I've thought about before, and I'm not saying this is happening, it will probably take like 5 to 10 years, is that somehow the political powers that be figure out how to use the independent creator economy like on a sleeper cell level to do their bidding for them.
Yeah, that could happen.
Like with influencer contracts and stuff like that.
Yeah, you saw the DNC do that. All the people that are out talking against me, a lot of them have cut checks from the DNC.
This moment is especially potent when you pair it with another part of the interview a little over 10 minutes later.
If you look at Google Trends specifically, like the phrase Somali fraud was borderline non-existent, it just so happens to really kick up through your piece on December 16th.
Yeah.
Which is the exact same day that the Trump administration and Kash Patel released the redacted Epstein files list that by all people was seen as like a disaster with hundreds of pages of blacked out stuff. Was there a part of you that was curious if maybe there was people in the GOP who chose to signal boost your piece as wide and far as possible in a way to distract and move the goalpost away from that?
I don't know. Like if that was their initiative, it probably worked pretty well.
There's a deep irony here insofar that the Republicans and the right more broadly have so successfully populated the online media space that it can get someone like Nick Shirley to orient his videos in their direction without any sort of instruction. It can simply be a product of someone desperate for clicks and attention online, and through trial and error, realizing that it's possible to make it as a media figure catering to right-wing politics, in spite of having little to no knowledge about anything they're talking about. The hosts all play an important role here. While watching the Callahan interview, I think it's fair to say that Shirley comes across pretty bad, at least based on the comments underneath it. While Callahan isn't terribly aggressive, there are bits of footage that directly contradict Shirley's more ridiculous comments very clearly.
As far as the wives go, that's not a thing in Utah?
It's not a thing in Utah.
That's a negative stereotype?
Negative stereotype. How many wives would you like to have?
As many as God will give you.
I grew up with 2 mothers and I absolutely loved it.
What Shirley says on the other podcasts isn't any more serious or thoughtful, but he does have far more compliant hosts, nodding along to most of what he says, asking the occasional challenging question, but often not acknowledging that Shirley's answers are ridiculous. We have the aesthetic of a serious, intensive interview being presented to the audience, but the host isn't there to challenge their guest, but merely give them a comfortable platform, oftentimes providing responses that smooth the rough edges and provide Shirley with a lesson on how to more effectively spread his message. They're less concerned about the truth of what the guest is claiming, and instead are more concerned with presenting their guest as a credible source for information, regardless of how true it may be. In addition to these podcast appearances, there were numerous other media sources where this story was spread without the presence of Shirley, all further emphasizing that this very poor video should be treated seriously.
Like it was
this
like a
Nick Shirley kid?
Yeah.
Is it him just being an independent journalist? He seems like a very smart kid. I've seen him. He was on Patrick Bet-David's show.
The actual content of the video is poor, but its aesthetic is convincing enough that it confirms propaganda that they already believe. That some of these people who don't even identify as conservative are nonetheless spreading this story around makes it seem even more compelling, and it demonstrates how pervasive this tendency towards believing these types of anti-immigrant narratives are. It's all this media non-critically discussing this video that makes it seem far more legitimate than it actually is. And all of it rides on this wave of aesthetics, completely avoiding any kind of substantive discussion. The commitment is primarily to narrative. I should also mention that Nick Shirley responded to the Andrew Callahan interview, saying that there were several deceptive edits that covered up the fact that Callahan agreed with him on a few points. After watching the interview on Nick Shirley's channel, it seems to me that Andrew Callahan was a little different in the unedited version in that he was a bit more aggressive and challenged Shirley earlier than we saw in the edited version of the interview. It's also a strange clapback by Nick Shirley, as the unedited interview doesn't make him look any better at all. If anything, it seems like he stammers and fumbles with his words a lot more, and I'm not sure what he thought he was going to get by posting this online. By the way, my analysis of Nick Shirley being heavily motivated by a desire for internet fame doesn't come out of nothing. To give you some background on him, back in high school, he was very much interested in making it big on YouTube, doing all sorts of weird stunts like taking his mom to prom during COVID and crashing Jake Paul's wedding. He also attended the January 6th Capitol invasion.
Most YouTubers wouldn't come in here and capture this because of political stuff. You know what? I don't care. We're out here, baby. Like and subscribe!
Although that part of the video is fun, my favorite part of the video actually happens a little later on. After watching him have a blast trying to get the attention of Alex Jones, interviewing people who broke into the Capitol, and generally having a good time, he walks everything back when he realizes that what he just witnessed might be a bad thing.
I had no idea that everything was so crazy until I got back to my hotel room and started looking at the news and everything. It was just horrible what actually happened.
This guy literally captured footage of someone smashing their way into the Capitol, and this was his commentary.
We're picking up subscribers as we're going right now.
This was far from the only time he's been involved with some shady stuff. Nick Shirley has done many videos about the dangers of migrants, so much so that he was highlighted in a report from Reuters that mentioned him as one of the people spreading fear-mongering about immigrant communities.
They portray migrants as dangerous and burdensome, a rhetoric echoed by Trump and his campaign.
Having somebody with a first-person point of view narrate as they're in space, it's following some journalistic practices and routines, especially broadcast news, but it feels more like there's a person that they can engage with, that audiences can engage with, and I think it all builds to a sort of credibility.
Shirley also has a video about the Somali American community in particular that he uploaded in July of 2025. It's titled, Inside the Somalia Capital of America, though its original title was Inside the Rise of Islam Across America, the fastest growing religion in America. The video itself seems far more concerned with Islam than any kind of fraud, but Shirley would later say that this is where he first heard the rumors of fraud. I don't know how true that is, but he certainly didn't do anything with that info until David provided him with documentation of government funding and stories of empty daycares. As for the content of this old video, it's not very interesting. He wanders around asking weighty questions that people struggle to answer. This couple made me laugh, though.
Christian values, would you say those are on the decline while Eastern values are on the uprise here?
I guess there's a lot of different interpretations of what Christian values are, so you'd have to be a little more specific.
Like the values of the Bible.
Yeah, but like people interpret the Bible in different ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
like the generic teachings, like the 10 Commandments.
I don't know. I think it just depends.
Shirley's work eventually got him to a meeting at the White House with some other pseudo-journalists like Andy Ngo. Through all of this, I think a pretty consistent portrait of Nick Shirley being an up-and-coming right-wing commentary channel more concerned with the propaganda narrative than the truth becomes clear. And I want to stress that much of this is being made possible through the support of a right-wing media ecosystem and right-wing politicians that has so thoroughly fertilized the online space that people like Nick Shirley can feel their way to success just by chasing the algorithm and finding a ready-made audience for videos like theirs. And we've seen plenty of copycats following in Nick Shirley's lucrative footsteps. Patrick Bet-David summed it up well at the end of his Nick Shirley interview.
So this is now going to be a new business model of people going.
I'd only correct that this business model isn't new. It's just one that's become decentralized from right-wing funding because of how effectively that funding has grown the media space to now include the potential for new figures to appear organically, easily slotted into media strategies that give them a boost in the algorithm. The consequences for this have been numerous, including federal funds being cut off entirely for certain childcare programs in Minnesota, a drastic approach that punishes every daycare, not just the ones supposedly committing fraud. It also disproportionately affects low-income families who rely on daycares that receive this kind of funding. Numerous daycares have also been threatened. Here are some comments from a news story. In addition to the break-in at Nokomis Center, other Somali childcare providers say they have been receiving harassing phone calls. We've been receiving hateful messages through our voicemail threatening us since the past couple of days, including one that happened yesterday morning after the break-in. This is frightening and exhausting, Mohammed said at a news conference Wednesday. Another consequence of his video, at least in Nick Shirley's mind, has been to provide some justification for the surge in ICE agents into Minnesota.
The Minnesota fraud scandal has erupted the nation as protests and riots took place, all starting because daycares like Quality Learning Center were exposed.
Although he's also said the opposite.
I think they've confused the fraud with the ICE, and they're trying to blame me for bringing ICE to Minnesota, but they were already there.
It's almost as if this guy has no clue what's going on and how his video impacts the wider world. Yet for some reason, people have sought out his opinion on the shooting of Renee Good.
Do I think he should have shot her? I don't know. I'm not in the position of the officer, but like I said, he's duty bound to protect himself, and she shouldn't have put herself in that position. She knew what she was doing. She was impeding a federal law enforcement investigation.
But you actually think she was trying to run him down?
I do.
Shirley's latest video, titled I Exposed Minnesota's billion-dollar fraud scandal, is even less convincing than the last one. He spends most of it wandering around getting yelled at by Somali Americans.
You want the clicks? You want the YouTube?
Tell me where the transportation vehicle is.
Clicks? You got YouTube clicks. Now get the out of our community.
This is a tried tactic of a lot of pseudo-journalists. When they can't find evidence of a story, they make themselves the story by playing the victim. And in Shirley's case, while surrounded by masked security. The fraud he's supposedly exposing in this one is transportation companies showing up at addresses and not finding parking lots filled with vehicles, possibly because the business listings are for their offices or mailboxes rather than parking lots where they may have their vehicles stored. But nonetheless, it's enough for Shirley to declare fraud. Although there is some concern over fraud when it comes to transportation companies, again, Nick Shirley drops the ball. An article in the Minnesota Star Tribune summarizes the findings of the video. The transportation providers Shirley highlights in his video are not listed as having received reimbursements from the state in Medicaid claims data provided by the Department of Human Services. Information on providers who billed for a very small number of services was not included in the data. In other words, if there's fraud here, it's probably not the government being defrauded, and if they are, the actual dollar amount isn't high enough to be reflected in the data. It seems like Shirley kind of gave up halfway through this one, and he went back to checking in on childcare centers. A bit strange considering he and David are constantly talking about how pervasive fraud is in so many parts of Minnesota's welfare programs. But rather than check out more of these new programs, he's going back to the same well. And naturally, he just gets yelled at some more, and he makes some inane observations.
Looking at the snow prints, does not look like there's any snow prints of any young children.
Do I even have to mention that he isn't allowed into the daycare center? The video is so pathetic that he's reduced to once again returning to the Quality Learning Center to squeeze what little juice remains from this meme.
Instead of quality learning, it says quality leering outside.
And he closes it by repeating the long debunked story of money being smuggled in briefcases at the airport that I've already gone over earlier in this video. I do appreciate the anonymous source he cites, admitting he has no direct evidence himself and that he's just repeating stuff he's heard.
Wow, so they take the money from Minnesota, take it to Atlanta, and then take it to Dubai, and then from Dubai they then wire the money.
Correct. I don't know that for sure, but that's what I was told by other investigators.
In the meantime, Minnesota is in the midst of a surge of ICE agents into the state, and there are real stories happening about ICE continuing to brutalize ordinary people and harassing immigrants. We're getting real journalists exposing the severe lack of oversight in who becomes an ICE agent, with journalist Laura Jadid managing to get a job offer from ICE with minimal effort. Meanwhile, the Vice President of the United States is claiming that ICE agents have absolute immunity.
The precedent here is very simple. You have a federal law enforcement official engaging in federal law enforcement action. That's a federal issue. That guy is protected by absolute immunity.
And Department of Justice officials are resigning because of an effort to prevent any sort of investigation into Jonathan Ross, the agent who shot Renee Good. The Department of Homeland Security also recently announced Operation Post-Admission Refugee Re-Verification and Integrity Strengthening in Minnesota, or Operation Paris, in which ICE is targeting refugees who have been legally allowed into the country. A DHS spokesperson said, "The operation in Minnesota demonstrates that the Trump administration will not stand idly by as the U.S. immigration system is weaponized by those seeking to defraud the American people. According to the many lawsuits that have followed this action, refugees, who haven't been charged with any crimes, are being detained and sent to camps in Texas, all under the guise of combating fraud."
Habeas corpus petitions tell the stories, like Laban Guled, a 29-year-old Somali refugee from Shakopee who says he's followed all the required processes and procedures, arrested at Chipotle during his lunch break.
So far, this enforcement disproportionately affected the Somali community.
Michelle Drake is representing a 16-year-old high school student from Minnesota whom she says agents arrested and separated from her family.
They didn't have anywhere to put her, and she spent the night in a hotel room with 2 adult ICE agents who were strangers to her, before thankfully the federal court intervened and stopped the U.S. government from sending her to a camp in Texas, which was their intention.
Drake says the 8 clients she represents arrested under Operation Paris do not have allegations of fraud against them.
Even if there was a need to investigate some fraud, which there isn't, since when in the United States of America do we lock people up in order to conduct investigations?
This is my own speculation here, but the targeting of the Somali community was in part because they are a vulnerable minority, and the targeting of the refugee community within the Somali community, even more vulnerable, shows that the administration's priority is targeting some of the most vulnerable members of the immigrant community. Nick Shirley's effort to demonize an immigrant community and the usefulness of that media explains why he is where he is and why he's getting the support he's getting. What we can learn from Nick Shirley's example and similar narratives that excuse the killing of Renee Good is that the individual actors matter far less than the ecosystem they find themselves within. If there was a selection process for intelligent commentators, I don't think Nick Shirley would have made the cut. But as someone who can orient his work towards the targets the right has found convenient, such as immigrants, and present it in an aesthetically convincing package, he can be incredibly useful. Perhaps even more alarming, maybe it's possible that the ridiculousness of Shirley is the point of why his work was highlighted in particular. It's about the exercise of power and demanding submission to it. It's about creating a media apparatus that will happily nod along to some garbage tier level of journalism, say it's worthy of a Pulitzer, and shape a reality that's formed by the administration exerting its power to demand people believe it. While working on this video, the New York Times released a lengthy analysis of footage of the various camera angles that captured the killing of Renee Good. It confirms what seemed very clear from early analyses, including their own, that the administration was lying about the event. But it doesn't matter how obvious the lie is, whether it's lies about a woman's murder or blaming a minority community for fraud within a state. What matters is that the administration is demanding people believe those lies, to believe reality is not what you see, but what they tell you to believe. It's a classic move of authoritarian regimes and media ecosystems that elevate stories like Nick Shirley's and various other completely vacuous commentaries are rather about submitting to power than any quest for the truth. As a message for anyone watching this in the future, I would not be the least bit surprised if fraud was discovered at a daycare or healthcare provider in Minnesota at some point. It may even be linked to one or more Somali Americans. The DHS in Minnesota has already confirmed that there are many ongoing investigations, and there have been many well before the Shirley video came out. The point of this video was not to absolve every member of a community of committing a crime. If fraud is being committed here, it's not simply an attack on people who pay taxes, but also the immigrant communities themselves. They deserve to have real services that aren't fraudulent. What they don't deserve are poor quality propaganda pieces like the Nick Shirley video that tries to bundle them all together as a group of undesirables. And as much as they try to pretend as if this is all about fraud, they also have a clear problem with the Somali community and are perfectly happy spreading lies about them. And when that community is being brutally targeted by ICE, they will justify any act of violence done to them or done to the people who stand with them. While I was working on this video, Nick Shirley dropped his second video on Minnesota to far less fanfare. It's almost like people don't really care as much since things have escalated in Minnesota to the point where videos like his aren't really useful as a justification for anything. It makes me wonder what kind of staying power he'll have in this space, but I suspect if he can produce similar videos for other states that the federal government has decided to crack down on, he might continue operating like this. I'm not sure if he's got the wits to survive in this media space because he seems pretty witless in general, but I think some other commentators have proved you don't have to be a genius to survive and thrive in right-wing media. There's lots of money awash for even the most mediocre of people to make it. One place where money is not awash is in the media space I occupy, so if you would like to see videos like this in the future, do consider becoming a patron or member of the channel. You can also subscribe to Nebula using my link below. That would also help me. Patrons and members get their name in the credits and early access to my videos, and some extra fun bonuses I throw in every now and again. If you would like to support me in a non-monetary fashion, you can like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, or share this video on social media. Thank you all so much for watching.